Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and to those of you joining us from overseas, hello and welcome. This is our very first seminar in the Modern History of Mathematics program here at the Isaac Newton Institute, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce our very first speaker, Professor Karen Parshall, who is the Commonwealth Professor Emerita of History and Mathematics at the University of Virginia. We're delighted to have her here this morning speaking about Oswald Veblen, and I will let Karen take it away. Thank you very much, Karen.
Thanks, Adrian. It's just an incredible pleasure to be here and to be part of this very first semester-long event at the INI on History of Mathematics. Very, very exciting, this whole event. Okay, so let me get started and take us back in time a little bit. So in September 1952, Democrat Harry Truman was in the White House, but not for long. Since he had opted not to run for re-election, it was Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson who found himself in a bitter race against Republican challenger Dwight Eisenhower. On the dais in New York City at the convention of the American Federation of Labor, Herbert H. Lehman, Democratic senator from New York, took advantage of that friendly forum to advocate for the Democrats. He also lashed out against the wave of McCarthyism that had swept across the country and that aimed at driving the incumbent political party out of office by leveling unsupported charges of disloyalty against some individuals directly or indirectly associated with the government. I wish I had time, he continued, to analyze in detail the techniques that are being used. The technique of the unproved and unprovable charge, of the big lie repeated again and again, long after it's been completely disproved, of the lifting of statements out of context, of the public accusations under the protection of congressional immunity, and then the citation of these congressional accusations as proof of the charge. And finally, by the most devilish technique of all, character assassination by association. So I don't know about you all, but it gives me shivers. And keep in mind, 1952.
Yeah.
Okay. Moreover, Lehman went on, this weapon has also been used to strike terror into the movie industry, the radio industry, the stage, the press, and the schools. Just months later, in April 1953, one from the schools, 72-year-old Oswald Veblen, found himself a victim of some of the very tactics that Lehman was talking about when his application to the State Department for passport renewal was denied. Okay, so as is well known, especially to this audience, Veblen was one of the most distinguished and respected members of the American mathematical community at mid-century. After receiving his PhD under E.H. Moore in 1903 at Chicago for a thesis on a system of axioms for geometry, he had proceeded to Princeton, where he continued to distinguish himself in geometrical research, moving from the postulate theory of his graduate student days to algebraic and differential geometry, as well as algebraic topology. After a tour of duty during World War I, first at the San Diego Proving Ground in New Jersey, and then at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, he served a term as president of the American Mathematical Society during the 2 calendar years, 1923 and 1924. In that leadership role, he succeeded both in putting the society on a firm financial footing and in personifying a new breed, the mathematician as scientific statesman. By the 1930s, he was hard at work helping to build the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, a novel experiment in American higher education, and aiding European mathematicians fleeing the nightmare of Nazi Germany and World War II. In his 60s, at the outbreak of that Second World War, Veblen once again served his country at Aberdeen, this time in the civilian capacity as personnel and scientific consultant. Indeed, Veblen's stature in the field nationally and internationally was acknowledged in 1950 when he was elected president of the 11th International Congress of Mathematicians, held in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the first ever hosted by the United States. Given such a biographical profile, Veblen would seem a very unlikely candidate for denial of a seemingly routine passport renewal. Or would he? So let's have a look at the case that the State Department put together against him. What proved to be Veblen's months-long bureaucratic nightmare began on the 18th of December, 1952. That was the date on the letter he sent to the State Department's passport office, innocently asking that his passport, which had been issued on the 26th of December, 1950, be renewed. Since it was issued on the 26th of December, 1950, it was up on the 26th of December, 1952. Okay, so he's asking just at the right moment. Since he had planned an extended European trip that would take him and his wife to, as he explained to the passport office, Great Britain, France, Italy, Switzerland, and perhaps Holland and Belgium, he and his wife needed proper documentation. No brainer. 4 months passed. The letter he finally received, dated the 22nd of April, 1953, from R.B. Shipley, the passport office's director, from 1928 to 1955, got right to it. I regret to inform you, it opened, that after careful consideration of your application for passport facilities, the Department of State is obliged to disapprove your application tentatively on the ground that the granting of such passport facilities is precluded under the provisions of Section 51.135 of Title 22 of the Code of Federal Regulations. But lest there be any confusion as to what that was, a copy of it was included. Entitled Limitation on Issuance of Passports to Persons Supporting Communist Movement, it specifically targeted persons who are members of the Communist Party or who have recently terminated such membership under such circumstances as to warrant the inclusion, not otherwise rebutted by the evidence, that they continue to act in furtherance of the interests and under the discipline of the Communist Party. Persons, regardless of the formal state of their affiliation with the Communist Party, as to whom there is reason to believe on the balance of all evidence that they are going abroad to engage in activities which will advance the communist movement for the purpose, knowingly and willfully, of advancing that movement. Shipley went on to explain that in cases within the purview of the regulations above referred to, it's the practice of the department to inform the applicant of the reasons for the disapproval of the request, insofar as the security regulations will permit. In your case, it has been alleged that you were a communist. Well, Veblen was stunned. A communist? I mean, I can just see him sitting in there in his office, opening his letter. A communist? How could this possibly be happening to him? An allegation by who? And with no information under the mat for him to go on? I mean, this is all he got. At least there was some recourse. The passport office would reconsider the request if requested to do so within 30 days. Such reconsideration would require Veblen not only to make his rebuttal, but also to submit a sworn statement as to whether he is now or ever has been communist. So the R.B. Shipley, who so coolly delivered the news to Veblen, was Mrs. Shipley, described by Time magazine in 1951 as, quote, the most invulnerable, most unfireable, most feared, and most admired career woman in government. Shipley not only personally reviewed each application for passport renewal or for getting a passport, but also had unreviewable power. In short, whatever she decreed about a passport stood, and as she stated in an interview to Collier's magazine in July 1953, at exactly the time Veblen's case was moving forward, quote, I believe in refusing passports to communists. So Veblen was up against a formidable adversary, but one thing in his favor was the word tentatively in Shipley's. So the passport office had long had an appeal mechanism, although it involved going before people who almost invariably looked to Shipley as the final authority. A little bit of a catch-22 there. So that was the process that Shipley had sketched for Veblen. In August 1952, though, that is 4 months before Veblen had written his initial letter of inquiry, the State Department had, for the first time, created a more official, presumably more objective, Board of Passport Appeals in the wake of a controversy sparked by Shipley's denial of the passport on grounds of suspected Communist Party membership to Caltech chemist Linus Pauling. Still, as late as 10 months into that board's existence, it had yet to hear its first case, which seems a bit odd. So why was that? Because that avenue was only open to those who had both taken the prescribed oath and then been turned down by Shipley a second time. Okay, so no oath, no turn down a second time, no prospect for an appeal. So this is a really tough set of criteria to satisfy. Still, seeing the distinct possibility of an out, Veblen immediately sought legal advice, turning to Edward Greenbaum. Son of former New York State Supreme Court Justice Samuel Greenbaum, the younger Greenbaum was a noted New York City attorney in his own right, a member of the Board of Trustees of the Institute for Advanced Study, and a Princeton resident, so one of Veblen's neighbors. Veblen needed both to draft his reconsideration letter and to begin to prepare his case, but both tasks seemed really daunting. How was he supposed to put together a case when he had no indication at all the basis of the passport office's intention? I mean, kind of hard. Regardless, the letter needed to come first, and it went through several drafts that bounced back and forth between Veblen and Greenbaum before it was finally sent on the 12th of May, 1953. In addition to stating categorically that the allegation that he is a communist is false, Veblen, quote, requested the opportunity to be heard and to be advised of the basis of the charges so that he might be prepared to meet them by presenting relevant information. And as for making that case, Veblen had also followed Greenbaum's advice and begun a thorough search of his files for anything that might serve to refute or perhaps even be construed as supportive of the charge of communism. Another confidant was Robert Oppenheimer in his capacity as director of the Institute and as colleague at the Institute. On the 15th of May, Oppenheimer arranged for Veblen to talk over these passport problems with a friend of his from Los Alamos days, a Washington, D.C. lawyer, Joseph Volpe. Volpe? I mentioned, Sloan and I were talking about this yesterday. There was one person whose picture I couldn't find. I came close. So if you saw the movie, this is the guy who played Volpe. Okay. Volpe, who had served as an assistant to General Leslie Groves and so to the Manhattan Project during World War II, had also been the general counsel of the Atomic Energy Commission until going into private practice in Washington in 1951. So as a result of the conversation that Volpe and Veblen had, Volpe went personally to the passport office in Washington on Veblen's behalf on the 18th of May. He reported back by letter the very next day on the details he was able to extract, and ultimately he agreed to serve as Veblen's lawyer in the case. What he learned at the passport office was sobering. There were not one, but 11 charges against Veblen. These involved Veblen's membership in or sponsorship of organizations believed to be Communist Front or that were otherwise deemed suspect. Specifically, the American Council on Soviet Relations, the American Committee for the Protection of the Foreign-Born, and the Scientists Committee on Loyalty Problems of the Federation of American Scientists. 4 more concerned reports that Veblen had signed open letters critical of Truman's arms program, the House Committee on Un-American Activities, the bill proposed by Representative Sam Hobbs in 1950 that called for the creation of internment camps for deportable aliens, and the Internal Security, or McCarran Act of 1950, that both required communist organizations to register with the federal government and made provisions for the investigation of suspected subversives. Yet another charge that Veblen had been actively engaged in propaganda activities of the Communist Party through participation in so-called peace organizations. Two more targeted Veblen's alleged associations with specifically named individuals who were believed to have been communist spies. Veblen and Volpe suspected that all of these accusations had resulted from, unbeknownst to him, FBI investigations into Veblen and his activities. But Shipley was also known to call on her brothers when assessing passport applications. Both of her brothers were private investigators, and one of them had actually been the director of the precursor of the FBI. So, these 10 charges were bad, but it was the 11th and final charge that Veblen deemed, quote, the most serious, namely the allegation that for years he had been a concealed member of the Communist Party. When Volpe asked the passport office for specifics on this, he was told that, quote, the information had come in from a confidential source. Hence, the department was not in a position to provide the informant's name or any other details. At the same time that it told Volpe that, it also admitted that it realized that this was going to make it difficult for them to confront this charge. Okay. It's just catch-22. Still, with actual accusations finally in hand, Veblen and Volpe knew what they were up against and what they had to do. Veblen's main task was to go back into his files and produce whatever documentation he could lay his hands on that related to each charge. Volpe also instructed him to put together a short biographical account with an eye toward documenting his life of loyal service to his profession and his country. Volpe would then mold it all into the legal whole that they would present during their interview in front of Shipley. So the two men finally found themselves before Shipley's reviewers in the dog days of the summer of 1953. Their written rebuttal ran to 8 single-space type pages, supplemented by 14 more type pages containing 11 exhibits. So it's quite a document. In fine legal style, it opened by recounting the chronology. April 22nd, 1953, passport renewal denied. May 12th, 1953, reconsideration requested. May 18th, 1953, Volpe to passport office. A list of the 11 charges followed. Since the passport renewal had been denied on the overall charge of communism, the rebuttal case began there. Taking the last charge first, for it seems to me that this is the most serious, I repeat, the allegation is false. Veblen then urged the State Department to review with some care the things that I have done in my lifetime in the academic field, as well as on the outside. He was confident that the conclusion would be that I am the opposite of a communist. My life has been devoted to science, to the students I have taught over the years, and to the institutions of learning with which I have been privileged to be associated. A 2-page autobiographical sketch followed in which Veblen was careful to emphasize not only his academic and professional achievements, but also his service during both the First and Second World Wars. So it was evident, too, that the scouring he had done of his files on the advice of both Greenbaum and Volpe had paid off. And all of you who've been in Veblen's archives know that it pays off for us today because it's all there, a lot of it anyway. You can throw much away. His exhibits 1 through 4 showed that he had explicitly taken political positions in stark opposition to those publicly espoused by the Communist Party. Specifically, in 1940, when the Progressive Left American Association of Scientific Workers asked him to sign a peace resolution, that's Exhibit 1, advocating U.S. neutrality in Europe, he personally protested vigorously against it in a letter dated April 30th, 1940, and that was Exhibit 2. He then joined other Princeton colleagues in sending a telegram to President Roosevelt on the 20th of May, 1940, that both registered their emphatic disagreement with that petition and stated their belief that the interests of the United States, as well as those of civilization everywhere, are placed in imminent danger by totalitarian aggression, and that our best national defense consists in assistance to those forces which are now opposing this aggression. Then, in the summer of 1950, the National Council of the Arts, Sciences, and Professions asked him to join in its bitter opposition, his words, to President Truman's intervention in Korea. Oops. Veblen not only refused to sign, but also resigned from the group, and that was his Exhibit 4. This is how he put it. It's not that there's much to object to in what the statement includes. And what the statement included was that the Korean situation could possibly be the start of the Third World War. Sure, it could have been. And that it was desirable for the United Nations to coordinate an international dialogue. Sure, it's probably desirable. But, as he said, what I object to is first, that it does not condemn the aggression by North Korea supported by the USSR, and second, that it does not applaud the resistance to this aggression by the US, Great Britain, and the other countries performing their duty to the United Nations. From here, the case proceeded to address each of the individual charges in from 1 to 3 tightly focused paragraphs. Relative to the 3 charges of membership in or sponsorship of suspicious organizations, Veblen's answers were quite candid. The American Council on Soviet Relations. As I've already indicated, he wrote, I was very strongly in favor of our making a firm stand against the Nazis. Later on, when Germany was at war with Russia and the United States, I was, like many Americans, in favor of all feasible help to Russia. Therefore, I think it possible that I endorsed, or at least agreed with, some statement of the Council. The American Committee for the Protection of Foreign War? Yes, he had initially allowed his name to be used by that committee, as the State Department had noted, since, as he put it, he generally agreed with its avowed purpose. However, he declined to serve as its honorary national chair when asked in 1948, and those were his exhibits 5 and 6. And in 1949, he not only refused to sign an open letter to President Truman from the group, but also withdrew his name from sponsorship, and those were his exhibits 7 and 8. And as for the Scientists' Committee on Loyalty Problems, he laid out the reasons for its founding, sketched some of its accomplishments, and concluded that not only had he always thought that the committee served an extremely useful purpose, but also that the agencies involved both welcomed the committee's intervention and thought that its work was helpful. So he's not denying anything. He's putting it in context. The fact that Veblen had signed 3 and allegedly 4 open letters further underscored his political activism, as well as his fundamental belief in democracy. It also demonstrated just how such activism could serve as ammunition during the war. Again, Veblen's responses were forthright. While acknowledging that he did not remember and had no record in his files of an open letter against Truman's arms program in 1949, he explained that it had been the case that before the Korean War, he did feel that we were placing too much emphasis on military matters and not enough on negotiation. This, however, had been his own view, quote, arrived at personally and in no way connected to the views of others or with the views or objectives of any organization, such as, it was tacitly implied, the Communist Party, of which he was being accused of having been a member. When he later realized that he had been mistaken in his views about the Korean War, he endorsed and vigorously supported our intervention in that war. As for his signatures on the 3 other letters, well, they were undisputed. He supported the abolition of HUAC, the House Committee on Un-American Activities, because he felt the committee, he felt the committee was doing more harm than good. And he opposed both the Hobbes Bill and the McCarran Act because, in the first instance, he, quote, shared the views of a number of other old-fashioned liberals. And in the second, he agreed with President Truman, who had vetoed the bill, as well as with many other patriotic Americans. The letters concerning HUAC, with the full list of signatories, and the McCarran Act, with so-called 32 notables amongst the signatories, Veblen was listed among those 32 notables, appeared, however, in the communist-run Daily Worker. This raised major red flags for communist times. Not good. As for being actively engaged in peace organizations, Veblen could only recall one peace conference with which he had any connection, and that was the so-called Waldorf Conference held in New York City in March of 1949. Indeed, he had been a sponsor of that event, which had been organized by the National Council of the Arts, Sciences, and Professions, the same group from which he resigned a year later, and the documentation of which constituted his Exhibits 3 and 4. As he explained, he, like many of the conference's other sponsors, had hoped that it would, quote, give a reasonable presentation of some of the basic issues which for a long time have kept the United States and Russia at odds. Problem was that HUAC, the House Committee on Un-American Affairs, had that very conference in its sights. In a special report, HUAC's members had branded it a super mobilization of the inveterate wheel horses and supporters of the Communist Party and its auxiliary organizations. And although HUAC rightly stated in its report, this published report, that Veblen had been a conference sponsor, it falsely claimed that he had been in attendance, a fact that he made explicit in his report. So, if then, in the State Department's view, Veblen was tainted by association via these sponsorships and endorsements, 2 more of its accusations tainted him by association with suspected communist spies: Israel Halpern and Frank Reed. In the former cases, the ones we've already talked about, the evidence was for the most part a matter of public record that was nevertheless open to interpretation. In the latter 2, though, it was rather more what Lamer had termed character assassination by association. Canadian-born Israel Halpern had done his undergraduate studies at the University of Toronto, where, like many of his liberally minded and politically inquisitive peers, he had taken an interest in Marxism. Moving on to graduate work in mathematics at Princeton, beginning in 1933, he initially had a mixed experience. His first year found him not only in what he viewed as thoroughly uninspiring courses with Luther Eisenhardt and Henry Bonenblust, but also in the thoroughly seductive lectures that the Institute's John von Neumann was giving on filter spaces. For his part, Veblen was busy with the new institute, although since it and the Princeton Mathematics Department shared space in the hall, Veblen and Halpern would have known each other. They literally would have been walking the same halls, even if their contact beyond that would likely have been limited to the common room because Veblen wasn't teaching in that first year. Halpern went on to earn his Princeton PhD on adjoints and closures of linear differential operators under von Neumann's direction in 1936. He then spent a year at Yale as a Sterling Fellow, and then 2 years at Harvard as a Peirce instructor, before returning to Canada in 1939 to take up an assistant professorship at the Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. That same fall, 1939, on September 10th, Canada entered World War II. Halpern taught for 3 years before joining the Army in 1942. He was attached to the Directorate of Artillery a year later and rose there to the rank of captain in 1944 and then major in 1945. It was in that capacity that he attracted what quickly became most unwanted attention. Unbeknownst to the Canadians, the Soviet Military Intelligence Organization, the GRU, had been active in Ottawa since 1943, under the guise of the Soviet military attaché to Canada, Colonel Nikolai Zhabotin. Zhabotin and his group had instructions to recruit Canadians who could provide information not only about the atomic bomb project in which the Canadians and the British were involved, but also about other military-related issues. Although it's unclear exactly how Halpern had gotten onto their radar screen, by the 28th of March, 1945, he had been approached by one of Zhabotin's operatives, Gordon Lunan, an officer like Halpern in the Canadian Army. As a member of Canada's Labour Progressive Party, that is, the reincarnation of its banned Communist Party, Lunan was correctly viewed by the Soviets as being well disposed to the USSR. His instructions were to recruit Halpern to report on various aspects of explosives and, if possible, to pass on formulas of explosives and its samples, specifically uranium-235. Well, Lunan's approach to Halpern was deliberately cautious, but actually it apparently was so cautious that in Lunan's view, he had not sufficiently impressed Halpern with the conspiratorial nature of the work he was asking Halpern to do. And although Lunan had initially described Halpern in reports back to Zhabotin as enthusiastic and politically experienced, he quickly came to view him as uncooperative, since he refused to provide information on or to discuss anything that was not already known to the Army, and therefore directly accessible to Lunan as a fellow Army officer. So Lunan sized up the situation this way, quote, "I think that at present he has a fuller understanding of the essence of my requests, and he has a particular dislike for them." Yeah, he did. In other words, Halpern had come to understand that he was being asked to spy, and he wasn't interested. So things might have ended there, except that his association with Lunan, and so with the Soviet military intelligence group operating in Canada, figured prominently in documents smuggled out of the Soviet embassy in Ottawa. On the 5th of September 1945, Igor Guzenko, Zhabotin's cipher clerk, and the man charged with encrypting and deciphering the messages and reports that passed between Zhabotin and Moscow, defected. In the months that followed, as Guzenko was grilled behind closed doors by Canadian, American, and British intelligence officials, the extent of Soviet spying in all three countries was revealed for the first time. Indeed, it's been argued that this was how the Cold War began. In Canada, the so-called Guzenko affair, which only became public on the 3rd of February 1946, had resulted, also in early February, in the creation of a Canadian Royal Commission to investigate Guzenko's allegations. By the 16th of February, 13 people, among them Halpern, had been seized and detained by plainclothes officers of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, with no charge made against them and with no opportunity to communicate with outside counsel or indeed with anyone on the outside. They were just snapped up and thrown in jail. By May, it had charged Halpern with conspiracy and violation of the Official Secrets Act. It had also tentatively set a trial date of on or about May 21st for him. As his friend back in Princeton, Albert Tucker, explained in a letter dated the 7th of May, and addressed to the friends of Israel Halperin, both Halperin and his lawyer are quite hopeful of acquittal on the conspiracy charge. But the utter stringency of the Official Secrets Act puts him in grave danger, since he must prove his innocence and explain all his actions and notes to the satisfaction of the court. As a result, this may be a very long drawn and therefore expensive procedure. But Tucker was encouraged to report that some $1,700 had already been raised for Halperin's legal expenses, $500 at the University of Toronto, $750 at Harvard and MIT, $250 at Columbia, and $200 at Princeton. A month later, the amount had increased by another $1,500. Enter. As one who had served at Aberdeen in 2 world wars, Veblen knew well the exigencies of the wartime expert. Moreover, ever the activist and self-styled old-fashioned liberal, Veblen both served as the author of and sent on the 18th of May, 1946, a petition to Canadian Prime Minister William Mackenzie King that was signed by various members of the Princeton and Institute faculties, among them Albert Einstein. The petition recognized Halperin not only as a mathematician of high standing, but also as a man of the greatest integrity. It went on to argue that if it was indeed correct that Halperin is alleged to have given certain general and undetailed information about a weapon already in wide battle use to a fellow officer in the Canadian Army, then almost every officer or scientist engaged in war research is guilty of crime. It closed by appealing to the traditional Canadian sense of fair play and true justice to ensure that Professor Halperin be given an unprejudiced and impartial trial. King received an identical petition from MIT's Norbert Wiener that was signed by mathematicians at MIT, Harvard, and Tufts. So Halperin's case didn't finally go before the court until 1947, so all this time he's twisting and so more than a year after his initial detainment. Although he was acquitted on the 4th of March, 1947, his association with the Gusenko affair haunted him for years, basically the rest of his life. In the eyes of the U.S. Passport Office in 1953, so 1947, he's acquitted. 1953, the U.S. Passport Office. 6.5 years later, the allegation on which he was acquitted is now haunting Veblen. The Passport Office's 8th charge against Veblen was that, quote, in 1946, he and others signed a statement which was sent to the Prime Minister of Canada in which they expressed confidence in Israel Halperin, one of the individuals arrested by the Canadian government for alleged atomic espionage. Veblen's 1946 petition to Mackenzie King on Halperin's behalf thus tainted him by association in 1953. With a once, and apparently in some quarters still, suspected communist. This fight was the State Department's 9th charge against Veblen was similarly accusatory. It held that he had associated with Franklin Victor Reno, an individual accused of espionage and later convicted of perjury. Reno's case in the United States, interestingly paralleled Halperin's in Canada. Both men were left-leaning, no denying that. Both were involved with artillery. Both were named by a government informant. Both long suffered the consequences. Frank Reno had earned a BA in mathematics at the University of Colorado in 1932 before moving eastward to enter the graduate program in astronomy at the University of Virginia. While in Charlottesville, he participated actively in the campus's communist-led National Student League. He was later alleged to have been, quote, one of our most objectionable radicals, whose specialty was lurking behind posts and hitting students over the head with anything handy whenever there was a row between the NSL and the conservative student body, which happened now and then. Earning an MA in 1935, he took advantage of President Roosevelt's newly formed Works Progress Administration to secure a job as an assistant statistical clerk in Washington, D.C. Sometime after taking this position, and for about 2 years, by his own accounting, Reno was a member of the Communist Party. Okay, he admits it. Although in 1949, he stated that this membership lapsed more than a dozen years ago. Indeed, that lapse would have roughly coincided with his appointment as a junior mathematician at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds Ballistic Research Laboratory in 1937. Still, a routine investigation conducted at that time by the Military Intelligence Division of the War Department did uncover, with no adverse effects at the time, his National Student Union participation. It didn't matter in 1937. Veblen had met Reno at Aberdeen in 1942 when he returned there to work as a civilian consultant. In his words, Reno was already the person in our military establishment who knew most about exterior ballistics as applied to trajectories of bombs. The War Department publicly acknowledged that expertise in the citation for exceptionally meritorious civilian service that it awarded Reno in 1945 for his compilation of bombing tables that had proved crucial in the Allied victory. Nevertheless, the whiff of communism that had already been perceived in 1937 wafted back over him while he was at Aberdeen. During the course of a so-called disaffection investigation in 1943, conducted when he was promoted to the civilian grade of mathematician, highly positive interviews with a number of Reno's then current colleagues, as well as all of the negative documentation from 1937, in addition to potentially negative accusations about Reno and his brother Philip, who was a suspected communist, were all in evidence. This time, the investigating agent, quote, recommended that this case be marked pending, subject to the check of undeveloped leads. Although it's unclear whether those leads were ever followed up, Reno continued in his position in Aberdeen, becoming chief of the bomb ballistics branch of the Exterior Ballistics Laboratory in 1944. At war's end, though, Reno entered an extended period of ill health. A nervous breakdown for which he was hospitalized was followed by a debilitating attack of writer's syndrome, which is now called reactive arthritis, that resulted in an extended medical leave from Aberdeen. Finally able to return to work in 1948, Reno signed the, by then, required loyalty questionnaire, thereby falsely attesting that he had never been a member of the Communist Party. Things might never have been detected had his name not come up simultaneously in the sensational allegations of espionage in the federal government made by communist spy turned FBI informant Whitaker Chambers. In 1948, Chambers named, both in executive session and publicly, former State Department employee Alger Hiss in testimonies before QF. Then, in a private interview with the FBI also that year, Chambers claimed that Reno had been a member of the communist cell in Washington in 1937 and had given him confidential information on the Norden bomb site. Although Chambers' allegation about the bomb site was proven false, it was true that in an effort to free himself from Chambers' grip, Reno had indeed passed him documents. They were shown, however, to have been discarded sheets of firing tables for a 1917 Browning machine gun that were, according to one of Reno's colleagues, quote, lying around the proving ground like toilet paper in a washroom. This was the problem with these informants. They didn't have the expertise, so Chambers didn't know what on earth he had been handed. He just assumed it was something significant. Nevertheless, Reno was called to New York in December 1948 to testify before the federal grand jury that was investigating Hiss, in particular, and communist infiltration of the federal government in general. His admission during his testimony of his former Communist Party membership triggered a loyalty investigation in Aberdeen. In September 1949, Reno was writing to the then director of the Ballistic Research Laboratory, Colonel Leslie Simon, telling him that, quote, I did not feel that I wished to return to the laboratories because my newspaper prominence might cause reflections on my colleagues there. Still, since he had never actually resigned, Simon had continued to carry him on the books, realizing full well that a return might not be permitted. But that just indicates how much trust his colleagues had in him. He hadn't been there for almost 3 years, but they still kept him on the books. Reno also wrote to various of his friends, among them Veblen, asking for advice and help in securing some other job. Veblen in particular confessed to having, quote, spent a good deal of time and thought on the problem of how to help him get back into a satisfactory career. As he put it to Simon, I think all of us who were in the ballistic laboratory during the war ought to do everything possible to ensure the survival of a man who contributed so much to the war effort as Reno did. Reno spent the year 1950 applying to various graduate programs in astronomy and in statistics, and seeking work in the emergent field of electronic computing. Although he had various promising leads, thanks to Veblen and others, nothing materialized. He was, for all intents and purposes, blacklisted, although he did finally find editorial work at the University of Denver Press. Matters became even worse in 1951, when, just before the statute of limitations would have run out, the Justice Department came after Reno for having perjured himself on the 1948 loyalty questionnaire at Aberdeen. Pleading guilty to that charge in federal court, he was convicted and spent the years from 1952 to 1955 in Leavenworth Prison. Veblen next heard of Reno in the summer of 1953, at exactly the moment that he was having these passport problems. According to a letter that Veblen received from Reno's mother, her son was eligible for parole, and she asked Veblen for whatever help he might be able to provide. Not surprisingly, perhaps, Veblen wanted to do what he could, which would have amounted to writing to Reno's parole. But he prudently consulted his lawyer about the matter. Equally unsurprising, under the circumstances, Volpe conceded, not without a certain amount of understatement, quote, that your involvement with his problem at this time bothers me some. Veblen seems to have taken the hint, admitting that he had wondered, quote, whether anything I wrote to the parole board would be submitted to the FBI and there be canceled out by the false material which we now have reason to believe to be in their file on me. It seemed clear to both Veblen and Volpe that some of that false material had found its way to the passport office and had been at the root of the difficulties that their case sought to rebut point by point. Veblen closed that case in the hope that the facts which I have furnished will help you to conclude that the department's ruling on my application for a passport was not justified. Still, he did not deny that at times my views might have coincided with opinions that had been expressed by people of a so-called left-wing or communist tinge. I have also never felt, he continued, that I should change my view because it happened to be shared by a communist, or that I should refrain from voicing objection to something because people of questionable political leanings were doing the same thing. He closed the case this way. I have approved of objectives which I believed in, and I have endorsed statements when they reflected my own point of view. Where I could not agree, I objected. When the actions of an organization caused me to question its motives or purpose, I withheld my support or withdrew. I firmly believe that such behavior is typically American. In the final analysis, Shipley and Gowdy, Veblen's passport was renewed on the 24th of August, 1953. So now this, I don't have a copy of his pamphlet. This is of the period. And one thing to notice is women didn't have separate passports.
What?
The man got that. That's why Veblen's passport would look just like this with his picture and Elizabeth Veblen's picture at the bottom. So I thought that was amazing. So to conclude, in the early 1950s, a period characterized by the communist mania generated by McCarthyism, the passport office had increasingly denied what many viewed as the civil right to travel abroad. Under Shipley's iron hand, a number of prominent, politically active citizens who were deemed critical of American politics and policies had their requests for a passport rejected. Since the passport office was under the Secretary of State, and since the assumption had long been that the issuance of passports involved foreign policy considerations, it took a test case in the courts to change that way of thinking. In 1957, such a case went before the Supreme Court of the United States, 4 years after Veblen's run-in with Shipley. Handing down the court's decision the next year, Justice William O. Douglas spoke for the majority in what had been a close vote. As he put it, the right to travel is part of the liberty of which the citizen cannot be deprived without process of law. The passport office had thus exceeded its authority in denying citizens that right. Veblen had been one of the lucky ones. He had succeeded in besting a long-entrenched system characterized by its excessive, misguided zeal, one that was, sadly, all too reflective of its time and place. Veblen's case, however, exemplifies that no one, regardless of their credentials or their standing, was immune to the communist mania of the 1960s.
Thank you very much indeed, Karen, for that wonderful talk. It's certainly given us much food for thought. We have time for questions. Does anyone have questions or comments?
I'm just, do you know if other mathematicians of the time also had their passports denied? I mean, it'd be hard to know because
It is hard. I know of a case where a passport was forcibly taken from the mathematician, and that was Chandler Davis. They came to his apartment in Ann Arbor, knocked on the door, demanded his passport, both his passport and so that meant that neither he nor his wife, Natalie Davis, who was at the time working on her PhD on sources in France, could go anywhere. So I know of that other example. But you're right. Part of the problem with this research is a lot of it is almost unknowable.
Yeah, because if someone doesn't travel, I mean, you wouldn't. That's yeah.
Right. So, but I do have at least one other example where the passport office was involved. And then, of course, Linus Pauling's case was famous.
Okay. Is there anything in the States that's related to Veblen's collaborations or exchanges with mathematicians or even the mathematical community abroad?
No. They didn't cite anything like that.
And did he have any? Did he collaborate with mathematicians from Eastern Europe?
Well, he was certainly in correspondence with mathematicians everywhere, and did a lot, of course, during the 1930s. My part is very well documented. Did a lot to bring mathematicians from Eastern Europe to the United States and to get mathematicians out of harm's way. So, I mean, I was actually surprised that that wasn't stated as one of the points against it, that he had done all of that and helped all of those people with what the passport office would probably have viewed as suspect political views.
Anyway.
Thank you, Karen. So, Dirk Stroik,
Yes. He's definitely, he's part of this story, but he's not part of this story today, but this book I'm working on, he's definitely part of that. I mean, HUAC came after him, he had to testify for it, and he was named by all sorts of people, and he couldn't teach for, I think it was 4 or 5 years, I don't remember the exact number of years, but MIT didn't fire him. They like with Reno and the Aberdeen Proving Grounds, they kept him on the books. And so I was just up at MIT this past summer, and the correspondence from the president's office I thought was really interesting. The president refused to capitulate on this. This was a matter of academic freedom, and nobody had any business telling him or his colleagues who could or could not be a member of their faculty. For political reasons. I mean, that had nothing to do with being a member of faculty at MIT. And he caught some flack from the trustees, but he fought that off too. So it's very interesting.
Who was the president?
Kimpton. Starts with a K. I'll get back to you on that.
So I heard that his wife then traveled to Europe to give his talk. Is that a true story, or is this anecdote?
I don't know about that.
Okay,
I don't
we were thinking about the passport.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
Well, Reinhard, then Gemma. Reinhard.
Thanks for this excellent talk, which is very important because Veblen is such a central figure, and good to have this detailed for the first time here. And it's, of course, a clear parallel to Oppenheimer himself
Yes.
in terms of visibility of these guys and merits
Right.
which they had. And I'm always amazed by these communist ethos or anti-communist, how ahistorical they were. First, I mean, his much more conservative friend, Berkhoff,
Yeah.
even he had to approach to relate to the Russians when they had solidarity, right? He considered writing there for the Pietri Mathematische Nauk and all this at the time in 1943,
Right.
and a few years later, this was held against them, not in the case of Berkhoff, but
Yeah, because Berkhoff was dead by then.
yeah, so it's just amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing. I mean, I almost can't give this talk because at certain points I just get too choked up. It's just too, it's just too close to the present.
We have Gemma, and then we have a question from online. Gemma,
I just had a brief historical question. The communist regulation or the anti-communist regulation that's cited in the denial of his passport.
Yes.
Do you know when that was first implemented?
I haven't looked that up,
Mhm.
but I need to look that up. I'm not sure when it was put into place, but I mean, Shipley had, like I said, started in that role in 1922. And from what I've read about her so far, she was already doing this kind of thing in the 1930s. So I don't know whether that statute dates to the 1930s, but I'll get back to you on that too. And I mean, I know I need to look that up.
Yeah. It's so powerful in its vagueness.
Oh, how are you supposed to combat that?
Yeah.
so I have a question from Michael Barani, who makes a very interesting point. Please can you ask Karen to what extent she has undertaken freedom of information process to see the FBI files of Veblen, Halperin, etc. He personally has seen Halperin's file.
Right. So yes, I did a FOIA. Veblen and Volpe are certain that the FBI has a file on. So I FOIA'd file. And the answer I got back was, we have no file on Veblen. So Michael, I'm going to try it a different way. Maybe I don't know, that maybe there's some other way to get through to them.
Yeah.
But the denial came back within about 3 weeks.
Yes, no, he notes that he hasn't attempted FOIAing Veblen's file, but he says if the Veblen group wants this material and doesn't have it yet, they need to act soon.
Yes, it takes
The
forever.
declassification process is currently many years long.
So, for example, Lee Lorch, I FOIA'd Lee Lorch, he's also part of this story. And his FBI file, we were told, is something like over 1,000 pages, and it would take up to 11 years to be at the head of the queue. So, I mean, this book is going to come out before anything. I got plenty from Lawrence's papers, but yeah, it's really, what Michael says is really true. They don't exactly want to make this easy.
It's just a comment. I mean, it's kind of remarkable to me that Shipley, as a woman, is in this really powerful position,
Yeah.
and yet I don't know if she was married or not, but
Yeah, Mrs. Reed Shipley.
yeah, so she's on her husband's passport. I mean, this is
Yeah.
I mean,
I don't know.
it's extraordinary.
It's really bizarre.
I mean,
Thank goodness times have changed.
I mean, and was it unusual for a woman to be in that kind of position at
Yeah.
that time?
Yeah, I mean, that's why the interviews with the magazines and stuff.
Yeah.
But there's another, I'm not very good at remembering quotes off the top of my head, but Roosevelt commented on, he's the president of the United States. Did he think she would give him a passport? He wasn't so sure. Yes, sort of to that effect. Yeah, no, she was apparently very formidable.
And she reviewed every passport herself. Well, and so maybe, I mean, it had to be that fewer people wanted passports.
Yeah, I did find some data on that. But in some years, it was well over 1,000.
Wow.
And if she's doing the kind of investigative work on each one, or having that kind of investigative work on each one, like she did on Veblen, it's really a full-time job.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I've got a lot of questions. I'll follow up some later, but so a piece on Sloan's question. When you put Albert Tucker's letter, since he was Canadian, and there he's writing in support of Halpern, I wonder if he got flagged.
He didn't get, I have found no evidence that he got flagged.
And then I think this was certainly true in 2014. Margaret Matchett holds the record for claiming the Fifth Amendment in her HUAC defense. So this is by now the grandmother-in-law of Melanie Matchett Wood, but the first and only woman student of our team in America. As of 2014, she held the record, and it came from her HUAC defense for claiming the Fifth.
And why did they call her up?
She was accused of being a communist, but not for her passport, just straight up.
That's what just from the other perspective in terms of people reviewing things for clarification, which I've had some experience with because I'm interested in signal intelligence. But, sometimes these documents continue to contain relevant information.
Yeah.
And so when you look at the declassification, you'll sometimes find that essentially everything has been released of any technical nature, but an individual's name has been blanked out.
Right.
And then there's an annotation that's a specific reason. So if you gave someone a 1,000-page document, it wouldn't be surprising that these things take time. And also some of these things have been collectively spines, the NSA intercepts and so on. Sometimes these things retain value of decades after they were first written. So there's actually some serious purpose.
Well, I have had some success in some of the things that I for you. And they come with a lot of blackout and so on, but still with information, usable information.
I was just curious if Shipley had a particular flag or reason for this, or if every passport application underwent this kind of scrutiny.
From what I've read about her, every passport application underwent this kind of scrutiny.
They should make a movie about her.
I mean, probably they didn't end up going into such depth about all the people because, but as soon as they found out that he had this connection and that connection, and he's listed as a name in the Daily Worker and all this, then he sort of becomes, flashing neon light.
Donna,
Sure. Yeah.
when did Shipley leave office?
1955.
Was it before that Supreme Court case?
Yes, the Supreme Court case was in 57.
We have Laura, we have Helena. So,
And Steve has had his hand up.
Oh, I didn't notice.
Steve needs
You
to
can go.
Okay. Actually, I have a follow-up to Nicholas.
Okay.
I'm wondering, did this episode have by the way, fascinating stuff, but did it have an effect on his behavior? Did he stop corresponding with people in Eastern Europe? Did he stop trying to help?
Who, Veblen?
Yeah. That's the answer I was hoping for.
So this is a follow-up to June's comment, because I had the same impression. It was really remarkable that Shipley was in this position. So I apologize. It's not the question about Shipley. I apologize if you have said this already, but what was her background? How did she have the expertise to make these kinds of assessments, or did she?
She was a government functionary,
Okay.
and I forget what she was doing before she got plucked to be the head of the passport office. But basically, she had no criteria.
That's incredible.
Other than she had been a government, sort of a government functionary.
So it was just her feeling about things.
Yeah.
Wow.
But she had those connections. She had two brothers.
Yeah, but that's even crazier, kind of.
She had her own personal attaché.
She did.
Who were also perhaps not qualified to make. I don't know.
Yeah, the bit that I read, a little bit that I read about her brother, who was the director of the precursor of the FBI, he didn't come across all that great, as far as, he did, it's great. But anyway, they both did become private investigators, so she did have her own private team.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Kind of two types of comments. One is from the beginning of your talk, I was thinking about you said something about that this atmosphere permeated also other areas of life, and there was, and now an insert. There was a mathematician escaping from Czechoslovakia because he was not a communist, and he was a friend with Veblen.
Mm-hmm.
So he could have been used as a candidate in that area. But when he came to the US, he was giving an interview about 5 years later, and in that interview he said, I escaped from the communists, but what you are doing here is complete hell. And I was thinking whether he was referring to this or to the general atmosphere, but this thing was also cut out from the interview, so it's in the script, but it was cut out.
What was his name?
Harvey.
Oh, yeah. He was a regular, he corresponded with them.
So I was thinking, well, at least he had done something.
Yeah.
He was voicing,
Yeah.
he was doing it. And
Well,
that's why he was-
is the interview in?
It's in your archives.
Oh, I see, okay.
But I have a copy.
Oh, okay, maybe I can read it. Okay.
So it was very good to see it flesh out what happened when, how helpless he must have been
Yeah.
to a certain extent.
Yeah, right. Well, I think that's how they all felt, just helpless.
Well, I think the sheer number of questions and comments that we've had after this talk show what an extremely stimulating, fascinating talk was. I'd like to thank Professor Parshall once more.